for the tournament. It's our guy, ESPN women's basketball bracketologist, Charlie Creme. Charlie, always great to chat. Thanks for hopping on.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me. Always love talking to you guys.
Yeah, so we're going into this year's tournament, and, man, it's impossible not to compare it to last year's, right? And there's been no tournament in the history of women's basketball that came with more hype than last year with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and everything that was swirling around the sport at the time. What is your sense, Charlie, of how women's basketball at the collegiate level has been able to capitalize on that heading into this year's tournament?
Well, Brian, I wasn't entirely sure what was going to happen or what could happen, but the ratings this year were the best regular season ratings that they've had in 16 years on the ESPN networks. So it's been a carryover year to some degree.
That's interesting because obviously so much of it was Clark, right? And she's not here anymore. She's, WNBA. There's plenty of places to watch her. Does that surprise you at all? I mean, it's obviously a great sign, right, for the sport that, people were obviously drawn into it by her or Angel if they're sticking around to watch everybody else.
I am a little surprised that it actually exceeded last year's regular season ratings. And keep in mind that this is just ESPN I'm talking about. There's for the most part, no Paige Beckers outside of a couple of games on ESPN this year. Mm-hmm. And outside of one or two games, there's no Juju Watkins on ESPN either. Now, I guess in fairness, if you're comparing, there was not a lot of Caitlin Clark on ESPN last year either because, the contracts changed with the Big Ten and the Big East now. But it still, to me, says that a lot of the people who came into the game last year because of Clark are now sticking around and watching these other teams and these other players.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned the two big ones this year. Like Paige Beckers and Juju Watkins are the two biggest individual stars in the game right now. And, people, go back in time, right? Like Paige Beckers was a star before Caitlin Clark was a star. And things shook out a little differently thanks to Beckers' injuries over the years. Where do you see those two resonating nationally at this point? Like, people know their names, but it's not quite Clark's level yet for big reasons. Like, what kind of mark can they leave here in the next few weeks?
Well, a couple of things. I think Watkins, because we're going to probably see her around for the next couple of years after this,
right,
is going to be a name that will rival what Clark did, or has a chance to at least, especially in a big media market like LA. But in particular this year, what really, really stinks is that we can't have both Paige Beckers and Juju Watkins in the Final Four because they're in the same region, and they're going to probably play each other in the Elite Eight again, and one of them is not going to be around for the biggest weekend of the season. And that stinks because, like you said, how are these two going to resonate? Well, one of them really won't on the biggest stage this year, and that part to me is unfortunate.
Yeah, and go figure, it's the same thing that happened last year, right? With those two literally, but specifically to Angel Reese and Clark last year, where they ended up playing in a regional final. It's I guess it proves the point that they don't seem this worried about future matchups, right? Because you'd think you would have done anything in your power to avoid that coming up in the tournament that early.
When the NCAA selection committee says that they do not think about storylines or matchups or anything else except seeding and bracketing the tournament is accurately and as balanced as fairly as they deem possible. And most people don't believe that at all, and they think there's all kinds of conspiracy theories and, this matchup was contrived. This, I think, is sort of proof for Exhibit A to say that, no, what the committee is saying is actually honest and true. Because if they were trying to manipulate things for television, there's no way that we'd have USC and Connecticut in the same region. And frankly, we didn't have to. It wouldn't have even taken a lot of quote-unquote manipulation. It would have just been a sort of a difference of opinion from the committee members to switch USC and Texas as the order of their number one seed. And no one would have argued with that either. So there's a ton of integrity in this. I think this is the prime example of that actually coming into play.
We got Charlie Creme, ESPN women's basketball bracketologist with us. So, Charlie, any big surprises in this bracket? Obviously, the men's bracket, everyone was losing their mind over North Carolina. Was there anything similar with the women's bracket, or did this go pretty much as you expected?
There was no lose your mind North Carolina equivalent in the women's bracket this year. I was surprised about a couple of things, most notably that South Carolina was not the number one overall seed. The committee chair, and a few times we were able to talk to her throughout the season with the top 16 reveal shows, and then, of course, on Sunday with the selection show, really hammered home that loss South Carolina had at home to UConn as a reason why they did not elevate South Carolina, in this case to the number one overall team, or in the last reveal to even the number one seed line. So it was very interesting that one game seemed to play so heavily on the minds of this committee, because South Carolina, otherwise, you put the resume up, it's better than anybody's, and frankly, it's not particularly close. When you talk about quad one wins, strength of schedule, the quality of teams that they beat, how they were playing at the end of the year, the fact that they won both the regular season and conference tournament of the toughest conference in the country. So I was surprised by that. And, there's a couple of notable things. I think Notre Dame going from number one in the country to a number 3 seed within less than a month was notable, although not terribly surprising. And 3 Ivy League teams getting in. I thought that was going to happen. That's the way I had it laid out, and it did happen. But it's the first time it's ever happened, so I think that's at least worth a note.
Yeah, that's just not something that happens coming out of the Ivy League. I mean, 2 would be a shock to you. The 3 is crazy.
Especially when you get 3 Ivy League teams in and only 2 Big East teams in. That says a lot about both conferences, I think.
Yeah, and obviously UConn ran roughshod through the Big East as they always do. We haven't talked at all about the number one overall seed. It's UCLA, and they're a team, for a variety of reasons. They're out on the West Coast, and certainly on ESPN, they're with the Big Ten now, so that's a lot of Fox games. Like, I don't know if a lot of people out east have seen a lot of UCLA basketball this year compared to certainly a South Carolina, or knowing about UConn, or you've heard of USC because of Juju. What is UCLA, and what can they do in this tournament this year?
Well, they are a number one overall seed for a reason. They only lost 2 games all year, and 2 of those 3 were to USC, or 2 of those games were to USC. The third game against USC, they delivered and won the game. So they sort of avenged to some degree the 2 earlier losses. They earned it in a sense that they did almost everything they were asked to do. I still don't think their season was as good as South Carolina's, although they did beat South Carolina back in November. So that carries some weight as well, and it did certainly carry some weight with the committee. With UCLA, they have Lauren Betts in the middle. She's 6'7". She's a vastly improved player. She's one of the best players in the country. Single coverage, she's virtually unstoppable. You're going to have to double her, and she's pretty good about passing out of the double team and sharing the ball. So, but the big thing with UCLA is they're other than Lauren Betts, they're not necessarily exceptional at anything. But they're good at everything. They don't have a particular weakness. They can shoot it. They've got enough players on the perimeter that can shoot it. They're going to rebound, and they can rebound outside of Lauren Betts. They play great. They do play great defense, but they don't have all of these teams that we say, they can. We've talked about maybe 6 teams that we think realistically can win it all, and UCLA is certainly one of them. And all of them have a flaw or a hole or a weakness you can kind of point to that makes you say, I'm just not sure. UCLA is the team that probably has the smallest of those things where you kind of – the big thing with UCLA is they've never done it before.
Right.
We've never seen them actually deliver on the biggest stages before. This is certainly the best team they've ever had, but we really don't know when the lights are the brightest and they're having to play a big Elite 8 game in order to get to the Final Four against it could be against an LSU, for instance, who's done it over and over again. They have a coach who's done it over and over again, Kim Mulkey. So how will UCLA respond in those moments? We don't know, and I think that's probably the big maybe hole or shortcoming that UCLA has.
Yeah, and I think we know this about LSU and Kim Mulkey. Betting against her, do that at your own risk, at your own peril, because she wins a lot of big games at this time of year. And to that point, You look back at the last two tournaments specifically, like South Carolina was a major favorite going into both, right? Like they got shocked by LSU a couple of years ago, and then last year they were just the best team, and they won the title. It just doesn't feel like there's a team like that this year. You said 6. Well, what's your list of teams that you wouldn't be surprised if they win the national title this year?
Well, my 6 has been and remains the 4 number 1 seeds: UCLA, South Carolina, USC, Texas. I throw UConn in there because I think they're almost 1A type of seed, not even really a 2. Mm-hmm. And then I still throw Notre Dame in there because Notre Dame was the best team in the country by most people's adjudication 3 weeks ago, mm-hmm. and just at the end, they've beaten UConn, they've beaten USC. They've beaten Texas, so it's there. It's certainly in them. They ran into some issues at the end of the year, I think, with chemistry, maybe with some fatigue. They're now going to have about 2 weeks off between their last game and their first tournament game. I think that'll do them some good. So even though Notre Dame's a 3 seed, I still put them on that list because the talent is at the same level as those other 5 teams. So those are my 6. Now, could someone else sneak in and win it? Maybe an LSU, maybe an NC State. I just don't know if those. I think those teams may be good enough to pull that one big surprise in the Elite 8. I'm not sure if they're good enough to put 6 of those games completely together to win a national championship, though.
Well, I feel good now, Charlie, because I speed bracketed in the segment before you were on, and my Final Four does have 4 of the 6 that you mentioned. I picked UConn. I don't know. It just feels like, it's been now closing on a decade since Gino's won a title. There's not that many years left, right? He's got Paige Beckers. I don't know if this is his best last chance. It's not like UConn's ever going to be totally out of the mix, right? But it feels like the pieces might be setting up if he's going to get one more here this year.
Well, I did pick UConn myself to get to the finals and play South Carolina. I did pick South Carolina to win. But I did a show with my colleague Alexa Philippou on Monday night on ESPN's YouTube outlet, and she had the same final 2 teams, but she made a very compelling argument for why UConn would win that game and beat South Carolina for a second time this season. And she was so passionate, she almost had me convinced that I made the wrong pick.
Okay.
That maybe UConn should have been my selection. And I'm of the ilk of you bet against Gino Auriemma at your own peril. But Dawn Staley also falls in that category. If they're playing each other, you've got to kind of pick. So you got to bet against somebody in that matchup. And in this case, I went with South Carolina. The revenge factor, perhaps, or just new setting, different environment. That maybe South Carolina would be more prepared this time. I picked South Carolina to win the championship.
Yeah, I had UConn, South Carolina as well. Now we have too many people that have had it, Charlie, so now I'm concerned about that. But it's you speak of one game swaying South Carolina off the 1 overall seed line. I thought UConn might have been missing whatever that it was, but when they worked them like that in that game, it's like, oh, it's still in there for this UConn team. Does it guarantee anything? But that game opened my eyes that the possibility was still there for UConn this year.
Well, you're right. And I said before that game, I was actually at that game, and I said on the air during game day, I said, we haven't really seen the full healthy UConn team this year, even though it's a lot healthier than they've been the last couple of years. But I said, today is the day we're going to find out what the full whole UConn team can do. And then they went out and beat South Carolina in Columbia by 29 points, and my chin was on the floor for better than half that game. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe that a South Carolina team could get their drums beaten like that. And that is what UConn is capable of. We talked to Gino Auriemma the other night on our show, and he said, well, when we're making shots like that, sure, we can beat anybody. Like nothing missed. So, of course. But they have the shooters. And that was one of the first games that AZ Fudd was back and feeling good, and she was on fire that day. If she can sustain any kind of – and she's been shooting the ball pretty well since. If she can sustain that kind of shooting accuracy and Paige Beckers delivers like she always does – which is ironic, though, because in that game against South Carolina, Paige Beckers was the only Husky that didn't shoot the ball very well. And then you've got Sarah Strong, who played great that day, and Ashlyn Shade, who made, I think, 5 threes in that day. If that kind of shooting, and no team in the country is capable of that kind of shooting like UConn. If that does happen, it only takes one day or one night to do it, then certainly UConn can be a national champion. And that's why I said they're almost like a 1A seed, because they're as good as those other four teams that we talked about as number one seeds.
Funny what happens when you have multiple former number one overall recruits on your team, how it can click on any given day. Oh, my goodness.
Just name three players, and they were all number one recruits.
Yeah,
Gino has a way of landing those people.
Yeah, he also has a way of being like, well, if only our number one overall recruits could get it together. Whatever. He is something. He is something. All right, Charlie, always great to chat this time of year. Appreciate a few minutes today, and enjoy the tournament. Thanks so much for hopping on.
You too, Brian. Always great to talk to you.
All right, our guy Charlie Creme, ESPN women's basketball bracketologist. Nobody better to chat some women's hoops with here as that tournament gets going.